Hello, dear friends. Today we have the great pleasure to welcome Vahan Bournazian at Faces of Armenia on Nagorno-Karabakh. To kick things off, Vahan, it would be great if you could introduce yourself, give a little bit about your background, and provide some context to your person.
Very well. So I was born in San Diego, California, where I grew up and got my education, and I practiced law in the United States for 10 years. And in 2004, I moved to Armenia, and I started teaching here in the university system. Mostly I've taught law, and specifically human rights law. And I also teach human rights fact-finding and reporting. And my background is that my grandparents are survivors of the Armenian genocide. They were from Kharpert and from Artsakh, and they were able to make it to the United States. And my father was born in the United States, and I was born in the United States, and now I'm here. The other issue is that in 1997, I came to Armenia for a conference, and I was able to go to Stepanakert and to travel to many other places like Jebrail and other border areas. And I was invited in 1998 to teach at Artsakh State University in Stepanakert. So I went and lived there for 4 months in 1998, teaching law. And I lived in Stepanakert again in 1999 for 3 months, again teaching law. And through those experiences, I have friends who are currently living in Stepanakert. I'm in touch with them, and they inform me of the continuous shelling of Stepanakert, the targeting of civilian residential areas, because they're living it.
Խանութն է։ Այսքան մոտ կրակել էին երբևէ ձեր տանը։ Մենակ եք ապրում այստեղ։
Չէ, ամուսինիս ամենի մամաս։
Տուժել է։ Չէ։
I have knowledge of that through these contacts. And I think that's enough for my personal background. I'll wait for your next question.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think that gives us a great foundation to shine some light on Nagorno-Karabakh. But I think to start things off, it's always great for our audience if you could give a little succinct summary of the history of the conflict, and maybe especially also from a legal perspective.
Very well. I want to focus on the fact that this is a claim for self-determination and that it's very well founded in the human rights framework. And I think that in order to fully absorb this, we have to take a step back, all of us, and ask ourselves, how is the world composed? The world is composed of nation states. If you look at all the international treaties, we see that the nation state is based on an act of self-determination, meaning that every country exists and is recognized as an entity before the community of nations because of self-determination. And self-determination is repeated in two of the most essential international human rights conventions, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And in both of those, it was so essential that it's repeated twice. So every country exists based on a claim of self-determination. This is important to recognize because it was utilized for reunification in terms of Germany. Mm-hmm. So in Germany's situation, you had, because of the Cold War, you had the division of East and West Germany. What was the human rights principle that allowed for reunification? It's self-determination. And what was the human rights principle that allowed for the independence of any of the states of the Eastern Bloc or the post-Soviet Union? It's self-determination. The conclusion, therefore, is that self-determination is superior to any territorial claim. A state cannot say that it has a superior claim to territory because self-determination is the basis of that state's own existence. So the primacy of self-determination needs to be clear. Now, if we look, based on that foundation, which is worldwide, we look at the Karabakh situation. So if you can start counting the years depending on when you want, but if we just take a gander at 405 AD with the invention of the Armenian alphabet, the first place that it was taught was in the Amaras monastery in Karabakh, because in 405 AD, that was the largest Armenian population. So the claim for Armenians living in Karabakh is very old. It goes beyond that to BC. But we should just forget about history and just recognize who's living there now. So we know that Armenians have always lived there and always maintained a population there and are the majority population there. In 1988, the renowned human rights dissident, Andrei Sakharov, who was a great proponent of human rights in the Soviet Union and did not necessarily, he did not advocate for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He advocated for the evolution of the Soviet Union. And in the Congress of Deputies, when he spoke in 1988, he clearly said that we all know that the internal borders of the Soviet Union, created by Stalin, was an act of divide and rule. It was a policy of divide and rule. And it's not only the Karabakh situation, it's the situation of many different Soviet socialist republics, where the borders were drawn in order for there to always be perpetual conflict. And the purpose of creating a framework in which there's always going to be conflict is so that a higher body or more powerful body can intervene and rule and dictate terms. And Sakharov said that that was a burden not only to the nationalities, but it was a burden on the Russian people, he said. So in that same year, we see that because of perestroika and the opening in the Soviet Union, a new Congress was elected, parliament, assembly was elected, democratically for once, to the Congress of the Autonomous Oblast of Nagorno-Karabakh. And they invoked a provision of the Soviet Union's constitution to reunify with Armenia. So since 1988, the story is reunification, and it's based on self-determination. So what happened, unfortunately, was in the Soviet Union, the power of the Communist Party was superior to law, was superior to rule of law. So even though the Armenians of Karabakh had initiated a process based on law, it was nullified by the Communist Party. But it gave notice to Azerbaijani authorities that they would lose territory with the growing potential for dissolution. So then we saw the massacres of Armenians in Sumgait. We saw the massacre of Armenians in Baku and their expulsion. And we saw the deterioration of the whole situation into ethnic conflict.
Sumgait happened in the early stages of the Karabakh movement. It marked the beginning of a downward spiral of events. It was a response to the demonstrations and the decision of the People's Deputies of Nagorno-Karabakh to formally request to transfer the oblast from Soviet Azerbaijan to Soviet Armenia on February 20, 1988. Sumgait fundamentally changed the nature of what had begun as a peaceful campaign for self-determination for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. The brutality of the pogrom that took place between February 26 to March 1 changed the narrative from a political one to one of safety, human security, self-defense, and ultimately, the militarization of the conflict.
And because of that, we also saw the Armenians joining together in Karabakh to declare their self-determination outright, because reunification had not been possible. The Soviet Union dissolved. They again exercised their self-determination rights, and until today, they have been advocating for that, for recognition. Again, we see recognition by other states is not forthcoming because the policy of divide and rule is more advantageous to the surrounding states. There is a couple of issues that we should look at here in this context. One, Russia is a federation that includes ethnic minorities who in the past have made demands for self-determination. Chechnya, for example. So Russia realizes that it's bad precedent to recognize a new entity under self-determination. Again, we see Azerbaijan. It has significant minority populations in specific regions that have a justifiable claim to self-determination. The Talish in the southern part of Azerbaijan have a justifiable claim for reunification with Iran, for example. So recognizing self-determination in terms of territory. And Turkey has also a large Kurdish population that has been mistreated, abused, and is continuously has its rights violated. And it has a valid claim for self-determination in the eastern provinces of Turkey. Georgia should be a federation because the Georgian territory includes various different ethnic minorities, but it doesn't function as a federation. And this is why Georgia has lost territory based on the self-determination claims of specific minority groups in Georgia. So we see that the states that exist that have emerged out of these internal borders of the Soviet Union all fear any execution on self-determination. So this is the background, but The background is also a continuous policy of divide and rule. And it's interesting, though, that the whole world is based on the nation state. Yet Armenia is one of the ones that is the least compromised in terms of that, meaning that Armenia is actually full-fledged a nation state. Armenia is a nation state because the government is representative of the majority of the population based on ethnicity and language. And Armenia also has done well in respecting minority rights. For example, the Yazidi population, which exists in Armenia, has relocated its principal religious center from Iraq to Armenia because they find that Armenia is a safe place for them to maintain a religious center and to maintain their population. So it's very interesting to see that Armenia does well in terms of the few minorities that it has and is truly more representative of the nation state concept. And Armenia itself, as well as Karabakh itself, now Artsakh, they both are clear representations of self-determination. And this is a precedent which is a threat to the surrounding states. I want to add that even though there is an ethnic component to the conflict, and the ethnic component has existed for a long time because Azeris are Turks who speak a Turkish language, and during the genocide of 1915, it was perpetuated in Western Armenian regions in today's Turkey by Turks, the Turkish government, Ottoman government. And it was also carried out in places like Shushi against Armenians by Azeri Turks. So there is a historic precedent of animosity. But to go forward with our interview, I'd like to speak, with your permission, about what is happening today, because I think it's important for us to understand that even though there is an ethnic conflict, that has not bothered anyone since 1994. So since 1994, we've had this ceasefire, which is not a full peace, but it's been relatively stable until today. So do you mind if we talk about current events?
Yeah, so quick question before we shine light on this. I just quickly want to point out with the human rights situation, I fully agree. I recently read the report from the US State Department of Human Rights in Armenia. And while it was overall a very positively worded report, albeit the situation in the penitentiaries. But what I want to shine on before we look at the current situations, so if we were to launch a legal defense for the Republic of Artsakh, what would be the correct bodies? What would be the correct courts to get an international claim that yes, Artsakh is independent or Artsakh can reunite with Armenia? Not militarily, but on a legal basis, what options are available?
Well, you know, the International Court of Justice still exists, but you're only going to get any type of enforcement of any court body through the Security Council. And we could have a 5-hour discussion on why the Security Council doesn't work. So, I mean, let's take, for example, the Palestinian situation. There is a court finding International Court of Justice found that the Israeli government's building of the wall and the trajectories of the wall, cutting off different communities from each other, was a violation of international law. There are plenty of good court judgments that can uphold human rights. There's no enforcement body. Or then, okay, there is technically an enforcement body. That enforcement body is severely compromised. The Security Council as an enforcement body is severely compromised because there are 5 countries that have a veto. And this veto power has created certain alignments such that different countries, in order to protect their interest, need to seek affiliation with one or more of those countries with the veto power. And the veto power is exercised by one of those 5 countries on behalf of their client countries. So this, again, undermines. Without the enforcement, it's a question of seeking recognition. I'm not sure. It's not the same. We often like to think of the European Court of Human Rights as an option. I don't think it would be an option in this overall context, but I want to point out that even the European Court of Human Rights, with a much better track record in terms of defending the rights under the convention itself, it also has an enforcement issue, because enforcement is by the ministry, the Council of Ministers. And there's a failing there, because then enforcement becomes a negotiation. It becomes which countries can develop enough clout to push the violating country to accept the court's opinion. So we still have a lot more work to do in terms of developing an international legal system of any merit or worth.
Yeah, I can only agree there. The idea is also to have a legal system that has teeth, that is not just the paper tiger. And I think that is significantly lacking in this conflict, so to speak. If we are continuing to the conflict, could you, of course, shine light on what happened? How did the situation escalated so quickly since Sunday, A? And B, could you contrast it with the 2016 Blitzkrieg and with the war that ended in the 1994 ceasefire? What is different today?
Okay, it's an excellent question. So the ceasefire, I don't be competent to talk about this, but we can in a broad paint, a broad spectrum, we can say that there was a stalemate. And so because of the stalemate and because of the conditions at the time, that it was in the interests of the parties as well as the bigger actors that were overseeing the situation to come to some temporary resolution. But notice that it was a continuous temporary resolution. There was never any final accord. And I think that we can say that this is reflective of the fact that bigger parties or the controlling countries are still operating on a policy of divide and rule. Let's just say it. Russia gets benefits from being able to sell arms to Armenia and Azerbaijan at the same time. And we know that Russia gets concessions. I believe that in part, at least, the reason why Armenia joined the Eurasian Economic Union instead of going towards the EU, which it had been working towards, was because of the security issue. So Russia, as well as other countries, benefit from insecurity. So if insecurity is maintained, then there's always the potential for selling arms, and there's always the potential for negotiating for concessions in exchange for some kind of allegiance, which is later undermined or forgotten. So if we look at 2016, some people say it was a test. I think in 2016, we had no transparency in this country. So it's hard for any of us to come to a conclusion, and I think there's probably others that are better capable than I am to giving an analysis of what was happening behind the scenes, because 2016 in Armenia was under a very authoritarian regime where there was no public information. So everything was a backroom deal. And that leads us to why this is happening today. So we see that in 2018, the Armenian population rose up against a very corrupt and authoritarian government, and that it was successful in bringing a change of government, and that it was a complete change in the public dynamic in this country, where during the corrupt authoritarian regime, people felt that there was no potential to have their voices heard, or no potential for them to participate. And so the concept was, why shouldn't I sell my vote? It's like more logical to sell your vote because you have no faith that participation would be recognized in any framework. But after participation through the protests brought about a change in governance, people went to the election and they honored the election because there was a completely different attitudes towards public participation. So people respected the election framework. There was no change in election code. There was no change in law. There was just an opportunity for people to participate as they had participated in the protests. And the people chose to make the election real. So we had the best elections in December of 2018. Since then, we see that we have a growing inclusive democracy. And we see various segments of the society that used to be excluded are more included. I'm talking about different minority groups, such as women's rights advocates, or just human rights advocates in general. We see that people from the civil society community are now serving in government, whether that be in parliament or in government positions. So this means that there's a new attitude, and that this attitude is solidifying, basically. So we have a democracy that's in the process of solidifying. And you can read the human rights reports, as you said. Now compare all of the human rights reports. Go to something like Human Rights Watch and look at the human rights reports for Turkey, Azerbaijan, or Russia. And what do we see? We see that democracy is continuously undermined. Go to the State Department reports, US State Department reports. Democracy in these countries is completely undermined. So basically we have authoritarian rulers who do not serve their population in any way. It's zero interest in the population because authoritarian rulers serve oligarchy. So oligarchy, authoritarianism, has to sell a story. You have to sell the narrative to the people. You have to sell a narrative of security because the only thing that they can offer is that they offer like, we are producing order. You might be living terribly economically, but we're going to produce order for you and we're going to protect your values from these foreign values, etc., etc. So it's like it's like trying to sell, they're just trying to sell security and protection. You have to have a foreign enemy for that. I mean, you need to focus on the enemy that is the cause of all the problems. Because it can't be that the authorities are corrupt. So Azerbaijan's standard of living is going down. Turkey's standard of living is going down. Russia's standard of living is going down. Russia has the sanctions problems. So more and more, you need expansionism. You need, listen to Erdogan's rhetoric. He's talking about resurrecting the Ottoman Empire. He's selling security and he's selling patriotism, or not patriotism, nationalism, in order to cover for the fact that these authorities do nothing for their populations. And we see that Armenia is a dangerous precedent. The people of Belarus are up in arms. It looks just like Armenia in 2018. Actually, you could argue that what's happening in Belarus is even more widespread than what happened in Armenia in 2018. Armenia is a dangerous precedent. Armenia is a dangerous precedent in terms of democracy for Putin, for Erdogan, for Aliyev. It's dangerous precedent. And we see that the only thing they offer is nationalism and destroying the foreign enemy, and also they make a lot of money in that. It's been said that Erdogan's family owns an armament plant. That some of the drones that Turkey sells to Azerbaijan is from his own family business. So there's all types of interconnections like that that need to be researched. So why is this happening now? Well, for Putin, he needs a distraction from Belarus, and he needs to destroy the precedent of Armenian democracy. And for Erdogan and Aliyev, well, Erdogan is basically taking control in Azerbaijan. It was reported that Azerbaijani Air Force gave its operations over to the Turkish Air Force. So there are these serious inroads there. And both of them are relying on punishing the foreign enemy. So, and it's all about this fake honor, nationalistic honor. It's a very old story. It's like from the Middle Ages, but it's just resurrected again and again. I say now because Turkey seeks to solve its economic problems with greater trade with Russia. And we know that the foreign ministers of Turkey and Russia had meetings before this latest wave of aggression happened. We know that Putin has put conditions forward. Putin wants Russian peacekeepers in Armenia. So Putin doesn't want for there to be reunification between Artsakh and Armenia. And they want to put a permanent peacekeeping force here.
I'm sorry to interject, maybe if you can drop then some words on the Russian military bases that are already located in Armenia. wouldn't one be able to make the arguments that they are, so to speak, an extension or a derivative of a quote-unquote Russian version of peacekeeping forces?
So the Russian military presence is always on the Turkish border, Armenian-Turkish border. And it's a holdover from the Soviet past because that was the Soviet border. And in some ways it still serves, in many ways it serves Armenian interests because if Turkey is becoming more and more openly belligerent towards Armenia, and becoming more of an active actor. But the Russian military bases, they've always been on the Turkish-Armenian border, and the proposal now is for the peacekeeping the Russian military bases, they're not technically described as peacekeepers. They're border reinforcements. It's still convenient and it's still important for the Russians to have control of the borders of Armenia because that's great leverage. And now they just want an extension of this. So now we will have, if we are, Putin's demands for intervention include, and this is something from 2016, by the way. In 2016, Putin was advocating for Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. So this is not something new. But what we're going to see is this expanded presence. If Armenia is put, depending on how long this struggle takes, Armenia needs to be able to be self-sufficient in this struggle. And if it comes a point where that self-sufficiency is compromised, then Putin's terms for protection, because once again, authoritarians only sell protection, but the price of the protection that they sell is costly. And notice how they instigate the conflicts in order to sell the protection. It's like a mafia security racket. So Armenia has to continue in terms of self-sufficiency with regard to its national security. Otherwise, we're going to see that the Russian demands for intervention on our behalf are going to be so costly that it will destroy Armenian democracy. So my point is that you have three dictators wanting to get rid of a democracy in their midst. You have Erdogan and Aliyev, who act under this glorification of nationalism against the foreign enemy in order to distract and pacify the population, so no one focuses on corruption. And you have Putin wanting increased influence in Armenia, and it will lead to a compromised state. We will become a compromised state. We will not be able to be a democracy. And the human rights record of the last 2 years, which is reflective of a real democracy, is going to dissipate.
So we will definitely then shine on the role also of the international community. But first and foremost, do you think, like shining onto the conflict at hand, the escalation, I think, the pace of escalation surprised all of us, how quickly it turned into a full-fledged war. do you think there were elements of planning? It was, so to speak, coordinated? And is there any way for a normal or for a return to normalization? And maybe if you can start with, from your perspective, starting Sunday, if you can give a brief timeline of the incidents that happened so far and what they specifically imply.
Okay. Great question. Planning, we can do the internet research and discover that in August, I believe it's August, Turkey and Azerbaijan held joint military exercises. In order to hold these joint military exercises, Turkish F-16s were transferred to Azerbaijan. Now we see that one of those F-16s engaged over Armenian, came into Armenian airspace and engaged with an Armenian army jet. And so we see that the Turkish aircraft and other military equipment, which was brought allegedly for the military exercises, remained and is now used. So in order to build a case, you need to look at the circumstantial evidence. That's very strong circumstantial evidence when you plan for military exercises and then the same equipment is now used in the war. If you look at, it's all over the internet, you can find very well documented interviews of Syrians being hired by Turkish security firms and transported through Turkey to Azerbaijan. And these interviews show that Syrians from northern Syria, they were promised a certain amount of money. They were told they were going to be security guards at military installations. They got to Azerbaijan and they were shipped off to the front, and they say themselves that they were tricked and that they were sent to fight in the war, and that if they refused, they were going to be jailed. So the rumors about the recruiting was in August. So again, these people are giving their own statements, and they're giving their statements to human rights organizations in Syria. They're not giving their statements to one of the parties in the conflict. And so they're credible.
We have information that indicates with certainty that Syrian fighters have left the theatre of operations, fighters of jihadist groups passing through Gaziantep to join the theatre of operations in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a new, very serious fact that is game-changing.
This is further confirmation there was a troop buildup before the hostilities began.
Of course, we began hearing rumors about this. I told you I got to confirm it on the 27th, but rumors were happening even before this date. So of course there was a buildup of force in order to involve them. If you want more details, I was told that they were told that they were going to be guarding some outposts and not contributing to the fight. And we know today that at least 30 of them died there during the fighting against the Armenian forces.
So there is plenty of evidence that it was planned. We also have the meeting, the phone call discussion between the foreign ministers of Turkey and Russia right before the war began. And in terms of how the war has progressed, well, it started off with heavy military artillery, and not only on the front, but also directed towards civilian areas. You see that Stepanakert was Stepanakert is residential, the capital city. It's been targeted almost from the beginning. We see that Hadrut, another city in Artsakh, targeted. And we see that they have also targeted Vartanis in Armenia proper.
Please also share a little bit of your insights of the implications that Armenia proper was also attacked.
It was, in my opinion, it was an attempt to provoke Armenia to act more directly, because they're always trying to instigate, because at the moment, Armenia is supporting the defense army of Karabakh or Artsakh. Mm-hmm. So they're always seeking to have evidence that Armenia did something directly. And they're always seeking that evidence in order to take more direct action against Armenia.
And to sell it to their own people as a necessary intervention.
Yes, that's very true. Thank you for that observation. So they're seeking to instigate. They want to instigate problems. And this is why for the first week, the Artsakh Defense Army was only responding. It was only responding to the aggression along its border. But because of the constant shelling, artillery fire towards civilian areas, which has created a problem of internally displaced people, there, as well as deaths and injuries. So the Artsakh Defense Army took one offensive action and attacked the airport from which drones were being launched against civilian populations. So they took an action within Azerbaijan proper. So this is an escalation. And now we see that the aggressors always want to paint the situation as equal combatants. They always want to paint it, they always want to have some kind of evidence that for their own population, as you say, that they are pursuing something noble and worthy. And so they're always instigating problems in order to get a response. So now we have, it's very legitimate based on international law, international humanitarian law. It's very legitimate for the Artsakh Defense Army to attack the airport because it's a military installation, because it's being used as a military installation. And the drones coming from there are attacking civilian areas. So it's completely legitimate, but now it just adds to their propaganda, the Azeri Turkish propaganda.
I want to interject here for a brief moment. I think especially our audience that lives in Europe or America has not experienced war firsthand. What kind of weapons are used? We've been talking about Stepanakert being shelled, but it's the capital sort of in the middle of Nagorno-Karabakh. So are they using unmanned aerial vehicles? Are tanks being used? How does a war take place, and how does Armenia defend themselves? I think an illustration would really help to understand what is at stake much better.
I accept that that's a very valid question. I don't think I'm very prepared to answer, but I'll try to give an answer. That first you have to distinguish between conflicts between soldiers and the targeting of civilians. And international humanitarian law makes a clear distinction that those participating in hostilities have one set of rules, and civilians are always protected under international war crime for civilians to be targeted. And this is what's happening in this situation, where from the beginning, the Azeri army has been targeting villages, Armenian villages along the border. And as I said, it targeted Vartanis in Armenia itself, which is a town in Armenia. And so civilians have become a target. This is a war crime. Unfortunately, there's not enough publicity about this. And when we say targeting, and what is happening to civilians is there is the use of these drones, and the drones can fire on people or buildings, and they have a range of weaponry, I believe. And there's also the use of missiles. So there's two different types of missiles. I'm not competent enough to give you the types, but you can find online. There's missiles that are being launched from Azerbaijan. And these missiles are aimed at, they hit the city of Hadrut, they've hit the city of Stepanakert, and they have caused damage to residential buildings. What happens when you're living this is that if the authorities have the possibility of alerting people, there's a siren system. So the siren goes off, and you must immediately escape from your apartment or your home and head into the basement. So most of the apartment buildings in these areas, they have a basement, and everyone crowds together in the basement because when the shelling is happening or the missiles are hitting, they break a lot of glass. Just the sonic impact breaks the windows. And so you cannot stay in your apartment and you cannot stay in your home. You have to be underground.
Another bombing. Residents who had left their homes hurry back inside. Many returning to their underground shelters. This is one of them. These women have remained here since the violence started.
Չենք քնում, ցուրտ լույս չկա, պատվալում ջուր չկա, ջուր չկա, տուալետ չկա, ոչ մի բան չկա։ Աշխարհին օգնեն, որ խաղաղություն տա մեզ։
When asked if they have husbands, brothers, or children fighting on the front line, they all raise their hands. The bombing continued for hours. A wounded man enters the shelter. He was injured when running to the building. As the bombing seems to weaken, some residents quickly return home to take food. This woman stops by the rooms of her children, all empty.
So what we have is young children experiencing immense trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives, and with their families in basements. And you do not know how long you will be there, and you have only what you brought with you. And if it doesn't stop, you will be there for a long time. And there's no getting out to get water, to get food, to go to the bathroom. You are huddled down.
So I really want to draw an analogy, an important analogy here, specifically also to the international community. So my grandma experienced the Second World War, and it was exactly the same story she was communicating to me when airplanes dropped bombs onto her city. She was like, she like had to like escape into bunkers in order to survive. And she really told me, still vividly remembering how you could taste the fear in the air, how you were just like running for your soul life. And if we are aware that actually the current situation in Armenia has parallels to the Second World War, we can only say how serious the situation is, and that more people need to become aware, because I think as a global community, we cannot afford to induce renewed massacres and atrocities against humankind.
My friend wrote me this morning. He's manager of a hotel in Stepanakert. He's born and raised there. And his hotel is filled with refugees. I mean, internally displaced people, people who have come from border areas. These are families, principally mothers and children, because men have gone to fight. And, it's difficult for him to express just like the sense of responsibility that he feels for all these families and what he can do considering this shelling of the city. And he wrote saying that the shelling is so continuous, it doesn't allow people to sleep. He cannot sleep. He's worried about his parents and his sister because they're in another part of the city. And he's just begging for it to stop. He wrote to me, we just need for it to stop. I can't go on.
Civilian infrastructures and civilian buildings with heavy missiles and aviation. Just today, Azerbaijan started heavily attacking the capital city Stepanakert. Azerbaijani armed forces started targeting intentionally civilian objects and population, as a result of which we have already tens of casualties and much more wounded. Cluster missiles, as a result of which we have many casualties. And my call upon the international community is to react properly, to stop talking and start acting. Don't be blind.
By any means, it must stop. It is so illegal and unethical to target civilians. And it was after World War II, as you raised World War II, that we have the international conventions that clearly prohibit this. The targeting of civilians and the shelling and bombing of civilian areas is illegal, clearly illegal. And yet again, we come to the question of how can we create accountability? Where is the enforcement of the international law? If the Security Council doesn't work, how can you have enforcement of these legal norms?
I mean, and in a way, it's I wouldn't say very funny, but it's pathetic. The international community at the time was saying, okay, oh my God, it's so terrible. So many millions of people died, atrocities were committed. So let's set up these international commissions, bodies, which will intervene in tendencies that are clearly illegal and prohibited by the intervention. However, when it's outside the scope of their authority, and by which I really would resemble authority to develop worlds and partners, then it very much becomes a game like, okay, it's not really in my umbrella of attention, so I don't need to care. They will sort of figure it out alone. And I think that there's a clear lack of action, of compassion and coordinated effort to support human rights in this war.
I think that you raise a very important point, and it is that we have this normalization of ethnic conflict. So that's why everyone always wants to focus on the ethnic conflict issue. The international media, it's the easy out. You know, the easy out is that to just brand everything as an ethnic conflict between two sides that are equal in terms of being troublemakers, that are equal in terms of just engaging in violence without reason. That's the easy answer. And then you don't have responsibility. If you have two ethnic groups that are in conflict with each other, then, oh, so it's not my fault. And that's why I want to remind everyone that even though there is an underlying ethnic issue, it's plain that this is authoritarianism versus democracy. This is an attack on democracy. It's an attack on self-determination by authoritarians. And this has international complications because it means also that these authoritarians who serve oligarchy show that everything is about competition and conquest. And the whole thing is just to expand sphere of influence, to expand markets, to just control others. It's the whole authoritarian framework is expansionistic, it's imperialistic, and it's all self-serving in terms of serving an oligarchy that is going to benefit the people of that nation who engage in this are harmed, as well as the people that are being attacked. So I want to remind you that Andrei Sakharov said it in 1988, imperialistic divide and rule, imperialistic policy is damaging to the population that is the victim of the aggression, and is damaging to the population that is called upon to exercise this aggression. And it's all based on these hierarchical structures of oligarchy. So, and this is why we cannot leave human rights to countries or to governments. Human rights has to be demanded by people, and it has to be collective effort everywhere. You need to have everyone demanding the same equality in rights and dignity. You cannot leave it to any government because governments are always co-opted by their oligarchies.
Very powerful words from Vahan Bournazian. Unfortunately, we are about to run out of time for this interview, but we very much hope there will be a second one. And today we learned more about the context of the history of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and the current implications and the current developments of the war. We would very much like to thank you for your insights and perspective, and I think they are very valuable and contribute to what we hope substantiated, thoughtful and productive discussion on the topic, and would like to ask, do you have any final comment for this session today?
I just want to ask everyone to ask yourself how you can take action in order to make sure that your government, your authorities act on the behalf of human rights of other people as well as your own population, because it's the only way to save the world from this continuous conflict.
thank you very much. I think deep words to take home, or how we like to say, food for thought, and please act upon. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And this was Faces of Armenia on the Nagorno-Karabakh War.